The whisper began before the music finished its first measured turn, a soft fracture in the polished certainty of the assembly, and by the time her name reached the far end of the hall, it no longer sounded like a name at all, but a verdict delivered aloud, careless and complete. She felt it land, worthless dowry, ruined reputation, phrases passed between silk sleeves and gloved hands with the ease of currency, as if her entire life could be reduced to a failed transaction. She did not lower her gaze. She did not stiffen. Years of practice had taught her that stillness was its own defense, that composure unsettled cruelty more than protest ever could. Around her, conversation shifted just enough to exclude her without openly doing so, leaving her standing inside a perfect circle of space that no one would claim. Then the Duke turned. It was not dramatic. He did not silence the room or command attention. He simply looked at her, fully, without apology or calculation, and in that instant, the whispering faltered. She felt the change before she understood it, the dangerous weight of being seen by the one man whose notice could either end her entirely or alter the room beyond recognition. She had learned long ago how quickly society decided which stories were worth believing. When her family's fortune collapsed, the loss itself had not condemned her. It was the hunger for explanation that followed. Someone had to be at fault, and she had been convenient, young enough to doubt, composed enough to endure, unprotected enough to blame. The dowry that once made her acceptable now marked her as a failure, proof that she had been overvalued from the start. She remembered the first invitations that never arrived, the smiles that thinned into politeness, the quiet recalibration that removed her from the future everyone else assumed. Survival had required discipline, no public defense, no visible anger, no appeal to sympathy that would be mistaken for guilt. Tonight was no different. She stood as she always did, back straight, hands calm, allowing the assembly to finish its judgment without her assistance. Yet the Duke's attention lingered, steady and unmistakable, and she understood at once the danger of it. His title insulated him from consequence in ways she could barely imagine, but attention was not the same as protection. Attention invited speculation, and speculation devoured women like her. He was aware of the risk even as he accepted it. The Duke had been trained since boyhood to read rooms, to sense the precise moment when influence could be exercised without fracture, and he felt that moment crack now beneath his feet. Everything about her presence contradicted the certainty with which others dismissed her. She did not beg to be forgiven. She did not perform innocence. There was nothing brittle in her restraint. It unsettled him. Without fully deciding to, he inclined his head, no more than acknowledgement, no less than recognition, and the effect was immediate. Silence rippled outward, not obedient, but shocked. The whisper died unfinished. What replaced it was something far more dangerous, attention redirected. She met his gaze at last, and in her eyes he saw neither hope nor fear, only the quiet understanding that whatever he had just done, neither of them would be allowed to undo it. She left the assembly before anyone could decide whether her presence still belonged there, moving with the same unhurried composure that had become her armor, aware that departure itself would be dissected later for meaning she had never intended. Outside the great hall, the night air pressed cool against her skin, a reminder that dignity was something she carried alone now, without witnesses or applause. Once, she had believed reputation to be a fixed thing, secured by lineage and careful conduct, but she had learned how quickly it could be rewritten by those with motive and reach. When her family's accounts collapsed, explanations were demanded, and silence, born of legal restraint and naive trust, had been mistaken for confession. She remembered the first time her dowry had been called worthless aloud, not as arithmetic but as moral judgment, as if financial ruin could only exist alongside personal failure. From that moment, every kindness offered to her had carried conditions, and every cruelty had been delivered with certainty. Survival had meant learning when not to speak, when not to ask, when not to reveal the depth of injury that certainty inflicted. She had endured by becoming precise, careful, and unreadable, allowing society to grow bored of her pain while she learned to live inside it. What unsettled her now was not the whisper, she had outlasted worse, but the Duke's attention, which followed her even beyond the walls of the assembly. She could feel it as clearly as she felt the night breeze, the dangerous awareness of being noticed by someone who had nothing to gain from pity and much to lose from association. She did not mistake his acknowledgement for rescue. Men of his standing did not act without reason, and reason was rarely sentimental. Yet she could not deny the shift his presence had caused. The whisper had faltered. Judgment had paused. For a single moment, The narrative had not belonged entirely to those who despised her. The realization frightened her more than it comforted her, because it suggested a possibility she had long denied herself, that the story told about her might not be finished. Possibility, she knew, was far more treacherous than despair. Inside the hall, the Duke remained where he was, acutely aware of the space her absence left behind. He had not intended to intervene, not consciously. His life had been constructed around discretion, around knowing when influence could be exercised invisibly and when restraint served better than confrontation. Yet something about her composure under condemnation had pierced that discipline. He had seen women plead for forgiveness they did not deserve and men deny guilt they clearly carried, but she had done neither. She had stood as if judgment were weather, unjust, unavoidable, and not worth flinching from. The room had accepted her disgrace because it was efficient to do so, because her family's fall required a narrative that preserved everyone else's innocence. He recognized the mechanism with uncomfortable clarity. Power, he knew, did not merely protect, it selected truth. And tonight, without fully meaning to, he had disrupted that selection. As conversation resumed around him, quieter and more cautious now, he felt the familiar pressure of expectation settle back into place. Advisors would notice, allies would question, the logic of distance would soon reassert itself, urging him to withdraw before association became alignment. Yet withdrawal no longer felt neutral. He had seen her too clearly for that. Somewhere between duty and conscience, an unease took root, one that refused to be dismissed as impulse. The Duke understood that whatever he chose next, silence or action, would define more than her future. It would expose the limits of his own. By morning, the Duke's name had already been threaded into conversations that pretended not to mention him, a familiar technique used by those who wish to measure reaction before committing intent. He heard it in the careful pauses of correspondence, in the way advisors framed their counsel as concern rather than warning. Association, they implied, need not become entanglement. Distance could still be re-established if handled promptly, cleanly, without spectacle. The logic was sound. It always was. Yet the Duke found himself unable to summon the usual indifference that made such calculations effortless. The image of her standing alone beneath whispered judgment returned to him with unsettling clarity, not because she had appeared fragile, but because she had not. Her restraint had been absolute, her dignity unperformed. He understood now that what unsettled him was not her disgrace, but the ease with which it had been accepted by others who prided themselves on discernment. Certainty, he had learned, was often laziest where it caused the most damage. He reviewed the history as others presented it, the failed accounts, the vanished assurances, the silence that followed. It was a story built on assumption rather than evidence, maintained because questioning it would inconvenience too many people. He recognized the pattern intimately. His own position had been secured by similar silences, truths unexamined because their examination threatened order. Until now, that order had benefited him. The realization carried discomfort rather than guilt, a recognition that privilege did not merely insulate, it instructed. He had been trained to accept outcomes as inevitable when they preserved balance, to value stability over scrutiny. Yet the memory of her composure refused to align with the narrative he was expected to uphold. She had not behaved like someone hiding from exposure. She had behaved like someone who knew exposure would change nothing. As the day progressed, he became increasingly aware of the tension between what duty required and what conscience suggested. Engagements were discussed with renewed urgency, alliances framed as safeguards against uncertainty. Her name surfaced only as caution, never accusation, a shorthand for social contamination. Each mention sharpened his resolve in a way he did not fully anticipate. He realized that silence now would not be neutrality, it would be endorsement. The thought settled heavily, stripping his choices of comfortable ambiguity. For the first time, he considered what it might mean to use his influence not to preserve consensus, but to challenge it. The prospect was not romantic. It was destabilizing. Influence, once exercised openly, could not be reclaimed. By evening, the Duke had reached no conclusion, yet something within him had shifted irrevocably. The question was no longer whether he should distance himself from her, but whether he was willing to accept what distance truly signified. He understood that action would invite scrutiny, and scrutiny would demand justification. But inaction, he now saw, would demand something far more corrosive, the quiet acceptance of a lie he had the power to interrupt. Their next encounter was neither planned nor entirely accidental, arranged by the rigid choreography of obligation that governed such houses, where corridors funneled individuals together, and privacy was often a matter of timing rather than permission. She became aware of him before she saw him, a subtle shift in the air that drew her attention, even as she maintained her measured pace. When they found themselves momentarily alone, the silence that settled between them was not awkward but alert, charged with awareness rather than uncertainty. She did not retreat, nor did she advance. Experience had taught her that proximity itself could be misread, and she would not be the one to invite misinterpretation. Her composure held, precise and unyielding, as if she had decided long ago that dignity was something to be preserved regardless of witness. The Duke spoke first, not with apology or explanation, but with acknowledgement. He named the risk plainly, without softening it into courtesy. His presence near her had consequences, and he made no attempt to deny them. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, absorbing the reality he laid before her without flinching. When she replied, it was not to reassure him, nor to ask for restraint, but to assert herself. She told him she did not require protection purchased at his expense, nor would she accept kindness that expected gratitude in return. If he chose to stand near her, it would be his decision, not her petition. There was no bitterness in her words, only clarity. She had survived long enough to understand the cost of misaligned intentions. Her response unsettled him more than reproach ever could. He had expected resistance shaped by fear or appeal shaped by desperation. Instead, he found resolve. She neither minimized her situation nor exaggerated it, presenting her reality without ornament or plea. In that restraint, he recognized a strength that demanded respect rather than sympathy. The power between them shifted subtly, recalibrating into something less predictable. This was no longer a matter of a disgraced woman and a powerful man, but of two individuals negotiating consequence with open eyes. When they parted, nothing had been promised and nothing resolved, yet the encounter lingered with disproportionate weight. For her, the conversation confirmed what she had suspected. He saw her clearly, without illusion, and that clarity was dangerous. For him, it dismantled any remaining belief that he could intervene lightly. Whatever path lay ahead would require commitment, not impulse. The space between them, once defined by rumor and assumption, now held something far more volatile, mutual recognition that could not be undone. The pressure to withdraw arrived wrapped in concern, delivered by the few remaining connections she still trusted enough to receive counsel from. It was suggested quietly, framed as prudence rather than surrender, as if retreat might preserve what little dignity remained. Absence, they argued, would allow the scandal to exhaust itself, would spare her further humiliation, would make her less convenient a target. She listened without interruption, understanding the kindness beneath the advice, even as it wounded her pride. Disappearance had always been the preferred solution for women whose presence complicated order. She knew the logic well. To endure visibly was to invite cruelty, to vanish was to make others comfortable. For the first time in years, she considered whether exhaustion might justify acceptance. She had endured long enough to recognize how relentless judgment could become when sustained by certainty. Yet withdrawal carried its own cost. It would confirm the story told about her, not because it was true, but because it would go unanswered. She had survived by standing still, not by fleeing. The thought of erasing herself now felt less like self-preservation and more like capitulation. Even so, fatigue pressed heavily, tempting in its promise of quiet. What unsettled her most was the awareness that her continued presence now affected more than herself. The Duke's attention had altered the calculus. Her disappearance would not be neutral. It would carry implication, perhaps even relief, for those eager to see the disturbance resolved. She found herself resenting the choice precisely because it mattered. Across the estate, the Duke sensed the shift before it reached him directly. He noticed the way conversations tightened when her name was mentioned, the subtle encouragement offered toward distance disguised as discretion. He understood the pattern immediately. Withdrawal would be framed as sensible, even generous on his part. It would cost him nothing and restore equilibrium effortlessly. The ease of that outcome disturbed him. He recognized, with sudden clarity, that disappearance was not absence but erasure, and erasure was a decision made by those powerful enough not to suffer its consequences. The idea of her quietly removed from sight unsettled him far more than scandal ever had. He realized then that resistance could no longer remain internal. Silence would finalize what cruelty had begun. If she vanished, it would not be because she was guilty, but because endurance had been demanded too long without relief. The thought hardened into resolve. Whatever action he chose next would not be subtle, and it would not be easily reversed. For the first time, the Duke understood that allowing injustice to proceed uninterrupted was itself an exercise of power, and one he was no longer willing to perform. The Duke began his inquiry without announcement, aware that questions asked too openly often served to warn those who benefited from silence. He revisited accounts that had been dismissed as settled, correspondences archived without scrutiny, timelines accepted because they aligned conveniently with assumption. What emerged was not immediate vindication, but fracture, small inconsistencies that suggested intention rather than accident, debts reassigned too quickly, assurances withdrawn at precisely the wrong moment, testimonies offered by those who had everything to lose if examined closely. The pattern was unmistakable. Her family's collapse had been an opportunity seized, and when explanation was demanded, blame had been redirected with calculated ease. He recognized the architecture of it instantly, having watched similar structures preserve reputations far sturdier than hers. As evidence accumulated, discomfort sharpened into anger, not theatrical, but exacting. He understood now that truth had not been absent, it had simply been inconvenient. Those who had shaped the narrative had relied on her restraint, her refusal to dramatize her own defense, mistaking dignity for weakness. The realization unsettled him deeply. Power, he saw, did not merely suppress truth, it trained others to ignore it. Each discovery reinforced his growing certainty that neutrality had never existed in her case. Silence had been an accomplice. He did not share his findings with her immediately. Protection offered without leverage would collapse under scrutiny, and he would not subject her to another round of disbelief. Instead, he continued methodically, gathering proof not to persuade society, whose memory was selective, but to dismantle the structure that sustained the lie. With every document, resolve replaced hesitation. This was no longer about curiosity or sympathy, it was about responsibility. Meanwhile, she sensed the shift without knowing its cause. The world around her felt tighter, more watchful, as if decisions were being made in rooms she would never enter. She continued as she always had, composed and unreadable, unaware that beneath the calm surface of order, something deliberate was forming on her behalf. And for the first time since her disgrace began, someone with the power to change the outcome was no longer content merely to observe. Their next meeting unfolded beneath a tension neither could pretend was accidental. By now, scrutiny followed her openly, and his proximity to her was no longer interpreted as coincidence but intent. She addressed it before anyone else could. When they found a moment beyond the immediate reach of observation, she spoke with deliberate calm, acknowledging the rumors surrounding his continued presence in her orbit. She did not accuse him of recklessness, nor did she ask him to withdraw. Instead, she drew a boundary with quiet precision. She would not become a liability masked as benevolence, nor would she accept protection that framed her as helpless. If he stood beside her, it would be because he chose alignment, not because he believed her unable to endure alone. Her words carried no bitterness, only clarity forged by experience. She explained that disgrace had taught her how easily intention could be rewritten by spectators, how generosity was often recast as evidence of guilt. She had learned to survive by refusing narratives she could not control. The Duke listened without interruption, struck by the absence of self, pity in her tone. What she demanded was not distance or defense, but honesty. She wanted to know whether his actions were deliberate, because deliberateness carried consequence. Anything less would endanger them both. He answered her with equal restraint. He did not deny the risk, nor did he minimize it into courtesy. He told her plainly that he understood what standing near her invited, and that awareness had not diminished his resolve. He would not pretend his interest was casual. The admission was not romantic, but it was unequivocal. In that moment, something essential shifted. Curiosity dissolved entirely, replaced by respect grounded in recognition. They were no longer participants in rumor, but individuals negotiating truth. When they parted, the distance between them felt narrower, charged not with sentiment but with certainty. She understood now that his presence was intentional, and that frightened her more than indifference ever had. He understood that restraint alone would no longer suffice. Whatever came next would require decision, not observation. Pressure arrived from within the Duke's own household with the efficiency of long, established expectation. It did not announce itself as command, but as concern, couched in careful language about legacy, stability, and the responsibilities attached to a name that had never been permitted to belong solely to him. Advisors spoke of opportunity, of alliances newly available and carefully timed, of engagements that would secure influence and restore ease to conversations that had grown strained. Her name surfaced only obliquely, never as accusation but as warning, a reference passed lightly as if its meaning were universally understood. She had become shorthand for disruption, proof that disorder spread if not contained. Hearing her reduced so neatly sharpened something in him that had already begun to harden. He listened without interruption, outwardly compliant, inwardly unmoved. The logic was familiar. Distance would solve everything. Silence would be interpreted as correction. The world would resume its comfortable equilibrium, and his authority would remain unquestioned. Yet the ease of that solution repelled him. It demanded nothing but acquiescence, and he had begun to understand how often acquiescence served injustice. For the first time, the structures that had once insulated him felt constrictive, their insistence on obedience less like protection and more like erasure of choice. He realized that what was being offered was not stability, but submission disguised as wisdom. She sensed the shift long before he spoke of it. Invitations cooled further, politeness thinned. The quiet spaces around her widened in ways that signaled imminent exclusion. She understood what was happening even without confirmation. Society was preparing to close ranks, to test whether his resolve would falter under pressure, applied privately rather than publicly. The possibility of loss sharpened into something tangible. For both of them, the bond that had formed, unspoken yet undeniable, suddenly felt fragile. Not because it lacked strength, but because the forces aligned against it were precise and relentless. The stakes rose, no longer abstract, no longer distant. What followed would not be decided by sentiment, but by choice under constraint. The sleight was executed with practiced subtlety, delivered in a manner that allowed its architects to deny intent while ensuring its effect landed cleanly. An invitation she had received in writing vanished without explanation, her name absent from arrangements finalized with deliberate haste. When she arrived regardless, composed and precise as ever, the pause that followed her entrance confirmed what had been intended all along. Polite confusion masked satisfaction. Apologies were offered without urgency, framed as error rather than exclusion, but the message was unmistakable. She was not expected to remain. The humiliation cut more sharply for its restraint. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct to withdraw before cruelty could escalate, and she prepared herself to do so, with the grace endurance had taught her. Before she could move, the Duke crossed the room. He did not hurry, nor did he speak. He simply positioned himself beside her, close enough that no interpretation could soften the gesture into coincidence. The effect was immediate and irreversible. Conversation faltered. Eyes turned. The quiet recalibration of hierarchy began at once. His presence reframed the moment, stripping the slight of plausible deniability. Where she had been made to feel provisional, he rendered her undeniable. The act was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable, and it carried cost. He felt it settle instantly, the shift in regard, the calculation beginning anew among those who had assumed his silence was assured. She understood the risk even as relief flickered through her. Gratitude rose, tempered by fear, not of attention, but of consequence. This was no longer private alignment. This was declaration by proximity. She met his gaze briefly, a question unspoken between them, and he answered it without words. He had chosen to be visible. The alliance formed in that moment was quiet but absolute, forged not in defiance, but in refusal to allow erasure. Neither would pretend now that retreat remained an option. The conversation that followed took place beyond the reach of spectators, not because secrecy was sought, but because honesty required space unshaped by performance. They spoke without preamble, the tension between them stripped of its earlier ambiguity. What had occurred in the room did not need explanation. It had already rewritten perception. The Duke acknowledged the cost plainly, neither minimizing it nor offering reassurance that rang false. He understood now that discretion was no longer possible, and he did not regret the loss of it. She listened with measured calm, aware that his words were not offered to comfort her, but to establish truth. That distinction mattered. Comfort could be withdrawn, truth could not. She spoke then, not of the slight itself, but of solitude, the kind imposed rather than chosen, that narrows life until endurance becomes its own identity. She described how exclusion reshaped self-perception, how surviving disgrace required learning to exist without expectation of rescue. Her words were precise, stripped of self-pity, and in them he recognized a loneliness that mirrored his own, though born of opposite conditions. Authority, he admitted, had isolated him just as thoroughly, enclosing him in obligation that left little room for selfhood. Power, like disgrace, demanded performance. Recognition passed between them, quiet and exacting. This was not intimacy born of confession, but understanding forged through symmetry of constraint. Each saw in the other a life shaped by forces beyond preference, and each recognized the cost of refusing those forces too late. When they parted, there was no promise exchanged, no sentiment declared. Yet the space between them no longer belonged to society's judgment. It belonged to something more fragile and far more binding, mutual understanding that neither of them was alone, and that acknowledging this truth would carry consequences neither could yet fully measure. She did not intend to tell him everything, only enough to correct the record he had been forced to inherit, but restraint, once loosened, rarely returned neatly to place. What began as clarification became revelation, shaped by the careful discipline she had honed over years of silence. She spoke of misplaced trust, of assurances offered and withdrawn with strategic timing, of how documents had been altered just enough to redirect suspicion without leaving fingerprints. She explained how her silence had been misread as guilt, when in truth it had been enforced by counsel that promised resolution if patience were maintained. That patience had been exploited. Listening, the Duke recognized the elegance of the design, not crude theft, but reputational displacement, a crime that required belief more than proof. The narrative had been constructed deliberately, relying on her restraint and the world's eagerness to accept a simple explanation. Speaking cost her more than she allowed herself to acknowledge. She did not dramatize the pain of being disbelieved. She stated it as fact, measured and contained, yet the weight of it pressed into every pause. The injury was not merely reputational, it was existential. To be doubted when truth mattered most had reshaped her sense of safety in the world. She had learned to anchor herself internally, because no external affirmation could be trusted. Sharing this truth was not vulnerability in the sentimental sense. It was risk. Belief, once offered, could not be reclaimed without consequence. The Duke received her words without interruption, without the reflexive skepticism that passed for discernment among his peers. He did not question her timeline or seek corroboration in the moment. He believed her, not because the story was persuasive, but because it aligned with everything he had already uncovered. The significance of that belief was immediate and profound. He did not promise to repair what had been broken or to punish those responsible. He offered something far rarer, certainty. He told her simply that he believed her, fully and without reservation. The words landed with quiet force, altering the ground beneath them both. The consequences of belief arrived swiftly, not as confrontation but as withdrawal. Invitations thinned, correspondence cooled. Conversations that once assumed his compliance now hesitated, recalibrating around a Duke who had ceased to behave predictably. He felt the shift in the careful phrasing of advisers, in the polite distance of those who had once sought his favor with ease. No one accused him outright. Accusation would require courage. Instead, pressure arrived disguised as concern for his future, his influence, his legacy. Association, they warned, need not become entanglement. Silence could still be reclaimed if he chose it quickly enough. The offer was clear: retreat now, and the disruption would be forgiven. He did not retreat. The Duke's response was not dramatic, nor was it announced. He continued exactly as he had begun, consistent, visible, unyielding. When her name was spoken with caution, he did not correct it, but he did not distance himself either. His steadiness unsettled those who depended on fluctuation. Authority, when exercised without explanation, forced others to reveal their assumptions. He understood that protection offered inconsistently was indistinguishable from abandonment. If belief was to mean anything, it had to be sustained beyond comfort. She became aware of the cost through absence rather than confession. He did not burden her with the consequences of his choice, yet she felt them nonetheless, in the quiet narrowing of his social sphere, in the way certain doors no longer opened for him without hesitation. Guilt pressed against her discipline. She had spent years refusing to be the cause of anyone's loss, and now loss followed her again, this time carried by someone who had chosen it willingly. The knowledge unsettled her more deeply than hostility ever had. Their interactions grew quieter, heavier with implication. Nothing was said aloud, yet everything had changed. Commitment was no longer hypothetical. The Duke understood that restraint could not be maintained indefinitely. Pressure demanded resolution. And she understood that whatever decision lay ahead would not merely alter her circumstances, it would redefine the terms by which both of them lived. The escalation came disguised as finality. Documents began circulating with deliberate efficiency, presented as overdue clarity rather than new accusation, their language precise enough to appear authoritative and vague enough to resist immediate dismantling. The forged evidence did not scream deceit, it whispered inevitability. It confirmed what many had already decided to believe, supplying structure to suspicion and allowing society to congratulate itself on discernment rather than cruelty. For the heroine, the effect was immediate and chilling. Doors that had only recently reopened closed again with firmer resolve. Accounts were questioned. Her security, never abundant, threatened to fracture entirely. This was no longer reputational discomfort. It was danger rendered legitimate. Fear returned, sharper for its familiarity. She recognized the pattern instantly. The effort to end ambiguity by force, to make resistance appear irrational. Years of endurance had taught her how quickly such moments could calcify into permanence. She prepared herself for retreat, not out of shame, but necessity. Survival demanded calculation, yet before she could act, the Duke intervened openly. He challenged the evidence without preamble, exposing inconsistencies before they could harden into consensus. His response was not cautious. It was public, deliberate, and unmistakable. He placed his authority between her and the lie, refusing to allow the narrative to settle unopposed. The risk was immediate and significant. Allies recoiled. Neutral parties withdrew. What remained was clarity. This was no longer proximity mistaken for coincidence. This was defense chosen in full view of consequence. The impact was destabilizing. The forged claims stalled, not dismantled but contained, their momentum broken by resistance they had not anticipated. For the first time, belief did not arrive quietly. It arrived with weight. The heroine felt terror and grounding collide within her. Someone had chosen her publicly, not because she appeared blameless, but because he believed her worthy of defense, even when belief itself invited loss. In that moment, alliance hardened into commitment. The Duke understood there would be no return to ambiguity. He had crossed from observation into defiance, and she understood that whatever came next would demand a choice far greater than endurance. The Duke did not pretend that what followed could be managed quietly. The escalation had narrowed the field of possibility until only decisive action remained, and he understood with unnerving clarity that partial measures would now endanger her more than they protected her. When he asked to speak with her privately, there was no urgency in his manner, only resolve, as if he had already accepted the cost of the words he intended to say. They sat opposite one another, the space between them weighted with everything that had gone unspoken since the forged claims began to circulate. He did not begin with reassurance, he began with consequence. He told her plainly that resistance without permanence would not hold. Society could tolerate uncertainty, even defiance, but it would not tolerate ambiguity indefinitely. Her safety, her standing, even her ability to exist without constant scrutiny would remain precarious so long as she stood alone. Then he offered the unthinkable solution, stripped of sentiment and illusion. A union between them would end the question entirely. It would silence speculation not through argument, but through irrevocability. He made clear that this was not a romantic overture disguised as rescue. It was strategy chosen with full awareness of sacrifice. His reputation would fracture, his future would narrow. He would be bound to her disgrace in the eyes of those who refused to reconsider it. He did not soften the reality, nor did he disguise his willingness. The shock landed with physical force. Marriage, in this context, was not sanctuary but permanence, a decision that could not be revised once the threat passed. She heard not protection, but cost, his inheritance recalibrated, his alliances strained, his life altered by her ruined name. The weight of it pressed against every instinct she had honed to survive without becoming a burden. She searched his face for hesitation and found none. What unsettled her most was not the scale of the offer, but its steadiness. He was not acting out of impulse or pity. He was choosing alignment. For a long moment, neither spoke. The room seemed to hold its breath with them. She understood that accepting would end her isolation but entangle him irreversibly. Refusing would preserve his future at the expense of her safety. The choice before her was not between disgrace and redemption, but between solitude and consequence shared. As the silence stretched, She realized that whatever she decided, the life she had endured until now was already over. She refused him with a steadiness that surprised even herself, not because the offer lacked gravity, but because it carried too much. Her voice did not waver as she spoke, though every instinct urged caution, urged retreat, urged acceptance disguised as reason. She told him she could not consent to a future purchased at the cost of his own. Protection gained through his sacrifice would hollow whatever dignity she had preserved, turning survival into indebtedness she would never escape. She had endured disgrace without surrendering herself. She would not now accept rescue that demanded he fracture his life on her behalf. Her refusal was not born of fear, nor of pride alone, but of principle shaped by years of standing alone. To accept would be to agree that her worth required payment. The Duke listened without interruption, his expression unreadable but intent. He did not argue, did not soften the offer, did not attempt persuasion disguised as reassurance. He understood her refusal as precisely what it was, evidence of the strength that had drawn him to her long before he named it. Yet refusal did not resolve what lay between them. It sharpened it. The distance that settled afterward was deliberate, each retreating to protect the other from irreversible consequence. She prepared herself for renewed exposure, for the possibility that endurance would again be demanded without relief. She had chosen solitude before. She would choose it again if required. But the refusal did not end the matter. As she left him, she sensed that the choice she had declined had not been withdrawn, only postponed. And the Duke, watching her go, understood with unsettling clarity that her refusal had not altered his resolve. It had clarified it. The question before him was no longer whether she deserved protection. It was whether he was willing to choose the life he believed in, regardless of her permission. The Duke's decision did not announce itself through declaration, but through action taken where expectation had always ruled unchallenged. He confronted his family and advisers without spectacle, refusing the familiar performance of negotiation that allowed dissent to be absorbed without effect. He spoke plainly, not of affection or scandal, but of autonomy. His title, he reminded them, was not conditional upon obedience, nor was his future a communal asset to be managed for convenience. Alliances formed on silence were not alliances he intended to preserve. The restraint in his tone made the fracture unmistakable. This was not rebellion for effect. This was withdrawal of consent. The response was swift and measured, delivered in the language of disappointment rather than threat. He was warned of narrowed influence, of opportunities that would evaporate quietly if he persisted. The inheritance he had always assumed secure would be reconsidered, its privileges recalibrated to encourage compliance. He accepted the reality without argument. What surprised him was not the cost, but the clarity that followed. For the first time, his life felt deliberately chosen rather than inherited. Power, stripped of obligation, no longer felt ornamental. It felt earned. She learned of his defiance indirectly, through absences she could not explain and tensions that rippled through spaces once effortless. He did not seek her approval or burden her with consequence, yet she understood at once what he had done. The knowledge unsettled her deeply. She had refused him to protect his future, and yet his future bent anyway, reshaped by his own will rather than her consent. Guilt pressed against her discipline, accompanied by something far more dangerous: recognition. His resolve had never depended on her acceptance. It had only been clarified by her refusal. As pressure mounted, the Duke felt the narrowing of options become irrelevant. He had crossed the threshold beyond calculation. Whatever followed would not be mitigated by retreat. The path ahead was no longer shaped by duty or defiance, but by alignment with the man he had chosen to be. And whether she stood beside him or not, that choice would now be lived openly. Understanding arrived for her without ceremony, settling slowly into place as the noise around them shifted and the consequences of his defiance became impossible to ignore. She had believed his proposal an act of urgency shaped by circumstance, a solution demanded by danger rather than desire. Now that belief unraveled. He had continued to choose alignment even after she refused him, even after the necessity had blurred into risk borne willingly. The realization unsettled her more deeply than the threat ever had. His resolve was not transactional. It was not anchored to outcome. It existed independent of her consent, shaped by conviction rather than obligation. Against her careful discipline, feeling surfaced, not as longing, but as recognition, quiet and undeniable. She had spent years mastering restraint, teaching herself that attachment invited vulnerability she could not afford. Endurance had become identity, solitude a shield. Yet his steadiness pressed gently but persistently against those defenses. He did not pursue her, did not demand reassurance, did not frame his choice as sacrifice meant to inspire gratitude. He simply remained, consistent and unyielding, allowing her space without withdrawing presence. In that balance, something within her softened. Love, she realized, did not always announce itself with urgency. Sometimes it emerged as certainty that refused to be ignored. The awareness frightened her precisely because it felt earned. There was no illusion to hide behind, no narrative to blame if it failed. To accept what she felt would mean risking more than reputation. It would mean allowing herself to be chosen not out of necessity, but preference, and choosing in return. She had survived by refusing that kind of risk. Now survival was no longer the question. Meaning was. The Duke sensed the shift without pressing it. He recognized the change in her not through words, but through stillness that no longer held distance. He did not interpret her silence as retreat. He understood it as reckoning. Restraint remained between them, but it no longer functioned as barrier. It became threshold. Both understood that whatever came next would require courage not demanded by endurance alone. The pressure that followed no longer disguised itself as social maneuvering. What had once been rumor hardened into procedure, and procedure carried force. Notices arrived couched in formality, questioning her right to occupy certain spaces, to draw upon accounts long assumed, closed, but now reopened for examination. Protection that had once depended on courtesy began to fray, replaced by mechanisms designed to make existence itself untenable. This was not scandal as spectacle, it was erosion as policy. She recognized the shift immediately. Society, having failed to silence her through certainty, now sought to exhaust her through process. The danger was no longer abstract. It pressed against livelihood, safety, and movement, threatening to reduce endurance into collapse. She prepared herself as she always had, quietly, without appeal, yet something within her resisted the familiar posture. Endurance alone would not hold against machinery designed to grind slowly and without witness. She understood that standing alone now invited not dignity, but disappearance enacted legally rather than socially. The realization carried no panic, only clarity. Survival had reached its limit. Whatever came next would require commitment rather than restraint. The Duke saw the same signs and understood their meaning with chilling precision. Incremental resistance would fail. Visibility without permanence would invite retaliation rather than retreat. The moment demanded action not because he feared loss, but because delay would become abandonment disguised as patience. He recognized that this was the final narrowing, the point at which every previous choice converged into one unavoidable decision. To hesitate now would undo everything he had already claimed. When they met again, the urgency did not need articulation. It lived in the quiet between them, heavy and unmistakable. She looked at him without the defenses she once maintained, and in her expression he saw readiness rather than fear. The choice before them was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, irrevocable, and shared. Whatever they decided would not merely alter circumstance, it would define who they were willing to become when endurance was no longer enough. She accepted the Duke's proposal without ceremony, the decision spoken plainly and without illusion, as if clarity itself required no embellishment. The terms she set were precise, shaped by a need to preserve autonomy even within permanence. There would be no expectation of affection, no obligation beyond the protection their union afforded. The marriage would be strategic, its purpose explicit, its boundaries honored. She refused sentiment not because she felt nothing, but because feeling had always carried risk. He agreed to every condition without hesitation, recognizing that restraint was not distance but trust offered in its most disciplined form. In accepting the structure she required, he affirmed that consent mattered more than outcome. The decision did not feel like rescue. It felt like alignment chosen under pressure, deliberate and unromantic in its honesty. Hope entered cautiously, tempered by realism and an acute awareness of consequence. She understood that acceptance would end her isolation, but it would also bind him irrevocably to her past in the eyes of those who refused reconsideration. He understood that permanence would narrow his future, closing doors that might never reopen. Neither spoke of love. Love was not the reason they stood there. Yet something steadier underpinned the choice, mutual respect forged through endurance and conviction. When the agreement was sealed, the room felt altered, as if possibility itself had shifted position. She felt neither triumph nor relief, only a quiet readiness to bear what followed. He felt no regret, only resolve clarified. This was not the end of struggle, but the end of indecision. Whatever came next would be faced together, not as rescuer and rescued, but as allies bound by choice rather than necessity. The announcement of their marriage landed with a force no one had prepared to contain. Shock rippled outward, not in protest but disbelief, as assumptions recalibrated in real time. The Duke's name, long synonymous with measured authority, fractured under scrutiny. Alliances hesitated, favor cooled, and conversations grew cautious, where once they had been effortless. For her, legitimacy arrived abruptly, almost violently, as if a door had been thrown open rather than unlocked. The whispers that had followed her for years did not vanish, but they changed shape, bending under the weight of irrevocability. Society could tolerate ambiguity. It struggled with permanence. What could not be undone had to be endured. They did not celebrate. The ceremony was precise, restrained, conducted without spectacle or indulgence. Consequence, not romance, defined the moment. Within the Duke's household, adjustment began immediately and unevenly. Servants measured her authority, testing its boundaries through habit rather than defiance, while she moved with deliberate composure, neither demanding deference nor inviting familiarity. He honored the boundaries she had set, maintaining a distance that acknowledged choice rather than absence. Shared spaces became sites of quiet tension, glances that lingered, words carefully chosen, silences that carried more meaning than conversation. Reliance began to form through routine rather than intimacy, through small acts of consistency that neither named nor denied. Externally, the cost was unmistakable. Invitations ceased, favors evaporated. The Duke accepted the narrowing of his world without complaint, while she absorbed the unfamiliar weight of safety that was not earned through endurance alone. Together, they stood at a point of no return, bound by a decision that had altered not only how others saw them, but how they would be forced to see themselves. The marriage had ended uncertainty, but it had begun something far more demanding, a life shaped by shared consequence, where protection and sacrifice were no longer abstract, and where the future would be written not by rumor, but by the choices they continued to make. Life within the Duke's household settled into a rhythm defined less by ceremony than by adjustment, each day revealing the subtle negotiations required when two lives were bound by choice, but governed by restraint. She entered her new role without spectacle, aware that authority asserted too forcefully invited resistance, while timidity invited erasure. Instead, she moved with deliberate composure, learning the estate through observation rather than command, allowing routines to reveal themselves before altering anything. Servants watched closely, measuring her not for warmth but for consistency, testing whether her position would endure beyond novelty. She met each assessment calmly, neither demanding allegiance nor shrinking from expectation. Respect, she understood, was not requested. It was accumulated. The Duke maintained the distance they had agreed upon, not out of coldness but discipline. He did not intrude upon her autonomy, nor did he allow familiarity to blur the clarity of their arrangement. Yet his presence was unmistakable. Decisions were shared quietly, matters discussed without assumption, authority exercised in tandem rather than competition. In these exchanges, something steadier than intimacy began to form. Reliance grew not from affection, but from predictability. She learned that when he said something would be done, it was. He learned that her judgment was measured, attentive to consequence, unshaped by the desire to impress. Shared spaces carried a tension neither pretended not to feel. Meals were taken together with formality that softened gradually, conversation careful but genuine. Silence, once defensive, became companionable, a space where neither felt compelled to perform. She noticed small things, the way he adjusted to her presence without comment, the manner in which he ensured her authority was reinforced subtly rather than declared. He noticed how the household responded to her steadiness, how resistance faded not through fear but familiarity. Each day affirmed that partnership, even constrained, altered the shape of power within the walls. For her, the estate offered something unfamiliar, security that did not depend on invisibility. She could move without calculating every glance, speak without anticipating dismissal. Yet uncertainty lingered, woven through the quiet. Safety, she knew, could be temporary. She had lived long enough to distrust ease. Still, the absence of constant vigilance felt like standing in open air after years underground, disorienting but necessary. For the Duke, the cost of his choice manifested in absence, letters no longer answered, invitations no longer extended, influence narrowing with polite finality. He did not share this loss with her, but she sensed it in the quiet compression of his world. Guilt pressed against her discipline, tempered by the knowledge that he had chosen this path without hesitation. Together, they inhabited a marriage neither sentimental nor hollow, shaped instead by mutual restraint and growing trust. What had begun as contract now functioned as collaboration, laying the foundation for something neither had yet dared to name, but both were steadily, unmistakably building. The first true test of their marriage arrived without warning, carried on familiar channels that had once delivered rumor with polite restraint. Fragments of the forged accusations resurfaced, repackaged as concern rather than condemnation, presented as unresolved questions that deserved clarification now that her position carried weight. The intent was unmistakable. If her name could not be erased, it could still be unsettled, pulled back into doubt slowly enough to avoid direct challenge. The tactic relied on exhaustion rather than spectacle, on the hope that uncertainty would corrode legitimacy from within. She recognized it instantly, the same mechanism that had nearly undone her before, and felt the old instinct to brace, to endure quietly until the storm passed. This time, endurance was not demanded of her. The Duke addressed the claims openly and without delay. He did not seek compromise, nor did he allow the matter to be reframed as misunderstanding. His response was decisive, delivered through channels that carried authority rather than persuasion. He dismantled the questions methodically, exposing their recycled origins and the interests they served. Where once he had resisted spectacle, he now understood that silence would be interpreted as permission. His defense of her was unmistakable, not couched in affection or obligation, but in certainty. He did not defend her as a wife who benefited from his name. He defended her as a woman wronged, whose integrity did not require protection through euphemism. The reaction was immediate. Some withdrew entirely, unwilling to challenge a line so firmly drawn. Others recalculated, reassessing assumptions they had never bothered to question. The balance shifted perceptibly. For the first time, the heroine felt security that did not depend on invisibility or restraint. The shield around her was not fragile courtesy, but declared alliance. The realization unsettled her almost as much as it steadied her. She was accustomed to standing alone. To be defended so openly carried its own weight. Within the household, the effect was equally profound. Authority clarified. Servants no longer measured her legitimacy cautiously. It was reinforced without comment, woven into routine as fact rather than favor. The marriage, once strategic in function, began to operate as declaration. She felt the change in how she moved through shared spaces, in how decisions no longer required internal rehearsal. Safety, she discovered, altered posture before it altered belief. For the Duke, the cost sharpened. Doors closed decisively now, not gradually. Influence narrowed, not through argument, but omission. He accepted the contraction without hesitation, aware that clarity always demanded sacrifice. What surprised him was not the loss, but the absence of regret. Defending her openly had stripped away the last illusion that favor could be preserved alongside integrity. The choice, once made, proved sustaining rather than burdensome. That evening, they spoke little of what had occurred. No acknowledgement was required. The defense had been an act, not a gesture. In the quiet that followed, something essential settled between them. Loyalty had been affirmed not through promise, but through action. And for the first time since their union, the marriage felt less like protection against threat and more like a stand taken deliberately, together, against a world that no longer dictated their worth. With the immediate threat subdued, a quieter transformation began to take shape within the estate, one that did not announce itself but altered the rhythm of daily life with steady insistence. She found herself drawn into matters that had once been presented to her only as courtesy, accounts reviewed in passing, tenant concerns mentioned as afterthoughts, decisions assumed rather than discussed. Instead of declining, she listened. Instead of deferring, she asked questions. Her approach was measured, grounded not in ambition but in attention, and gradually the household adjusted around her presence as something permanent rather than provisional. Authority, she discovered, did not require assertion when it was exercised with consistency. She began with small changes, addressing inefficiencies that had long been tolerated because no one expected improvement. Tenant disputes were reviewed with care rather than dismissal, repairs prioritized where neglect had become habit, Obligations clarified so that expectation did not masquerade as tradition. Servants responded cautiously at first, unused to governance that neither intimidated nor indulged. Over time, resistance softened into respect. She did not position herself as savior or reformer. She simply did the work thoroughly, and thoroughness proved persuasive. The Duke observed these developments without interference, struck by the ease with which she assumed responsibility that others had avoided. He had anticipated obligation, perhaps even reluctance. What he found instead was competence shaped by experience. She understood precarity intimately and refused to administer power as abstraction. In her decisions, he saw the same restraint that had marked her endurance, now redirected towards stewardship. Their conversations shifted accordingly, less about strategy and more about collaboration. Authority ceased to feel hierarchical. It became shared terrain. For her, this reclamation of agency carried unexpected weight. Years of exclusion had narrowed her sense of usefulness, teaching her to exist without impact to avoid harm. Now, impact returned quietly, anchored in purpose rather than defense. She felt confidence re-emerge not as pride, but as familiarity, a recognition of capabilities long unused but never lost. The estate no longer felt like borrowed ground. It felt inhabited. The change was visible beyond the household. Tenants spoke of her with calm regard, noting fairness rather than novelty. Order settled where uncertainty had lingered. The Duke felt the shift ripple outward, strengthening what he had risked so much to preserve. Partnership, he realized, was not forged in grand gesture, but in shared responsibility sustained over time. Emotionally, distance narrowed without being erased. They moved through the estate with ease, exchanging glances that carried understanding rather than restraint. Affection remained unspoken, but trust deepened with each decision made together. The marriage, once defined by necessity, now operated as collaboration rooted in respect. What they were building did not require declaration to be real. It revealed itself through action, steady and unmistakable, shaping a life neither had imagined but both were quietly, deliberately claiming. The revelation arrived without ceremony, uncovered not through dramatic confession but through the slow unraveling of facts that could no longer support the lie built upon them. A document long thought, misplaced resurfaced during routine review, its contents contradicting the timeline that had condemned her so efficiently years before. From there, the structure collapsed quickly. Testimonies once accepted without scrutiny now appeared compromised. Records aligned too neatly to be coincidence revealed deliberate alteration. What had been rumor hardened into proof, and proof dismantled what endurance alone never could. Her innocence emerged not as interpretation, but as certainty, leaving no space for polite doubt. Vindication should have felt like release. Instead, it arrived weighted with complexity. The restoration of her name altered the balance that had governed her life for so long, stripping away the necessity that had once justified endurance. Society responded with predictable agility. Those who had withdrawn now resurfaced with softened apologies, eager to align themselves with truth once it carried no risk. Invitations reappeared, carefully worded to suggest continuity rather than reversal. She watched the shift with composed detachment, aware that acceptance offered now was less about remorse than convenience. Justice, it seemed, was welcomed only once it no longer disrupted comfort. What unsettled her was not society's response, but the question that followed. With her name restored, the marriage's original purpose dissolved. Protection no longer required permanence. Safety no longer demanded sacrifice. The life she had endured had been shaped by necessity. The life before her now required choice. Freedom, she realized, carried its own fear. Endurance had taught her who she was under pressure. Choice demanded she decide who she wished to be without it. The Duke felt the shift as keenly as she did. The evidence that freed her also threatened the structure they had built together. What had begun as obligation now stood exposed, its justification removed. He did not fear separation born of necessity fulfilled. He feared the vulnerability of preference unshielded by circumstance. For the first time, love, long restrained, pressed visibly against discipline. He understood that protection had been easy to justify. Desire would require honesty without defense. They spoke carefully in the days that followed, acknowledging the truth without rushing toward resolution. Neither wished to replace one form of obligation with another. The marriage remained intact, but its meaning hovered unresolved, no longer anchored by threat or strategy. In the quiet that followed vindication, Both confronted the same question from opposite directions. When survival is no longer the reason to stay, what remains? For her, the answer was not immediate. Vindication returned her agency, but it also returned uncertainty. She had learned how to live without expectation. Now expectation reappeared, demanding courage of a different kind. The truth that freed her had also stripped away the final barrier between duty and desire, leaving only choice and the frightening clarity that whatever she chose next would be hers alone. The Duke spoke when the quiet threatened to calcify into distance, choosing clarity over caution in a moment that allowed neither spectacle nor retreat. He did not frame his words as confession, nor did he reach for language softened by reassurance. He told her simply that the truth which had restored her name had not altered his choice. If protection had once been the reason, it was no longer the justification. He would choose her without necessity, without obligation, without the shield of circumstance to explain it. The certainty in his voice carried no urgency, no attempt to persuade. It was not an appeal. It was an acknowledgement of fact. She received his words without interruption, allowing them to settle fully before responding, aware that honesty offered without demand carried its own weight. The admission unsettled her more deeply than vindication ever had. Obligation had been something she could navigate. Choice required exposure. She had spent years learning how to exist without being wanted, how to survive without expecting affirmation. To be chosen freely meant allowing herself to be seen not as a cause, not as a responsibility, but as a desire. The vulnerability of that recognition pressed against every instinct she had built to endure. He did not ask her to answer him, nor did he expect immediate resolution. He understood that freedom, newly returned, could feel more destabilizing than disgrace ever had. Instead, he offered steadiness, the same restraint that had defined his actions from the beginning. His honesty was not a demand for reciprocity. It was a declaration of position, leaving space for her to decide without pressure or haste. In the days that followed, the atmosphere between them shifted subtly. The marriage no longer rested on unspoken necessity, but on an acknowledged truth that could not be ignored. They continued to move through shared spaces with ease, yet something beneath that ease had changed. Silence now carried meaning rather than defense. Glances held a fraction longer. Conversation deepened, not in volume, but in intention. Trust, once practical, edged closer to intimacy without being forced into shape. For her, the struggle lay not in doubt of his sincerity, but in confronting her own fear. To accept his choice would mean believing that she was not a burden disguised as purpose. It would mean trusting that love could exist without demanding sacrifice as proof. She had learned to measure worth by endurance. Now worth was being offered without condition, and she was uncertain how to receive it. The truth he had spoken did not resolve the question between them. It clarified it. What remained was not obligation fulfilled, but possibility opened. Love, once contained by necessity, now stood exposed, asking to be chosen deliberately. And in that exposure, she understood that the greatest risk she faced was no longer disgrace, but the courage required to believe that she was worthy of being chosen, simply because she was. Despite the Duke's clarity, she withdrew inward, unsettled not by doubt of his sincerity, but by the freedom his words placed squarely in her hands. Vindication had restored her name, but it had also returned choice, and choice felt far more dangerous than endurance ever had. When survival had been the measure, decisions were made for her by circumstance. Now circumstance stepped aside, leaving only her own will to answer questions she had never permitted herself to ask. She feared what acceptance might demand, not from him, but from herself. To stay freely would mean acknowledging desire without the shield of necessity, and that vulnerability felt unguarded in a way she had not prepared for. She began to create distance carefully, not through coldness, but through restraint renewed. She occupied herself with household matters, extended visits to tenants, correspondence that required attention, but no emotion. The Duke noticed the shift immediately. He did not interpret it as rejection. He recognized it as reckoning. He honored the space she created, resisting the impulse to reassure her again, understanding that reassurance offered too often could become pressure. His steadiness remained unchanged, a constant presence that neither advanced nor retreated. If she was to choose him, it would be without persuasion. Yet her withdrawal did not quiet her thoughts. Instead, it sharpened them. She began to question the belief that had guided her for years, that dignity required self-denial, that love was inevitably transactional, purchased through sacrifice or obligation. That belief had protected her once. Now it confined her. She watched the Duke accept the narrowing of his influence without bitterness, saw how he carried loss without resentment, and recognized that his choice had not diminished him. If anything, it had clarified him. The realization unsettled her most of all. She had believed herself unworthy of being chosen freely. His constancy challenged that belief without confronting it directly. Guilt surfaced alongside fear. She worried that remaining beside him would continue to cost him, that love itself might become another form of burden she imposed. The thought pressed heavily, tempting retreat disguised as virtue. Leaving, she reasoned, would preserve his future fully restored by her vindication. It would allow him to reclaim what he had surrendered. Distance could be framed as generosity. The logic was precise and deeply familiar. She had used it before to justify isolation. The Duke sensed the direction of her thoughts, even without words. He understood how easily restraint could become self-erasure, yet he refused to intervene prematurely. He had chosen her freely. Now he would allow her the same freedom, even if it risked loss. For both of them, this moment tested whether love could exist without coercion, without rescue, without necessity. The marriage remained intact, but its future hovered unresolved, suspended between fear of burden and hope of belonging. And in that suspension, she faced the most difficult choice she had ever known, not how to survive alone, but whether she could stay without apology, trusting that being chosen did not require her to disappear. The reckoning arrived, not with the drama many had anticipated, but with the quiet inevitability of truth finally permitted to stand unchallenged. Proceedings unfolded in rooms far less glittering than ballrooms, where attention could no longer be redirected by charm or rank. The evidence that had vindicated her privately was now laid bare publicly, stripped of euphemism and convenience. Names once spoken with respect were examined with the same scrutiny she had endured for years. The structure that had protected the lie collapsed under its own weight, not because society had grown kinder, but because denial had become untenable. What could no longer be defended was finally abandoned. She attended the hearings without expectation of triumph. Vindication, she had learned, did not restore time or erase memory. Still, as each contradiction was exposed, as each forged document was traced back to its origin, something loosened inside her that endurance alone had never freed. The certainty that had haunted her, what if they are right, what if silence looked too much like guilt, fell away completely. What remained was clarity. She had been wronged, not misunderstood, not careless, wronged. The distinction mattered more than she had ever admitted. Society responded with familiar agility. Those most complicit receded quickly, eager to preserve what could still be salvaged. Others expressed regret carefully measured to avoid implication. Apologies arrived without urgency, their sincerity diluted by timing. She accepted none of them and rejected none outright. Recognition was not something she sought from those who had denied it longest. Justice, she understood now, did not require their contrition to be complete. The Duke stood beside her throughout, neither shielding nor guiding, allowing the moment to belong to her fully. His presence was not protective but affirming, a quiet acknowledgement that her vindication did not belong to him to deliver. When the final ruling was rendered, dismantling the authority of those who had engineered her ruin, he did not look relieved. He looked resolved. The external threat that had once necessitated their union dissolved entirely in that instant. What remained between them could no longer be explained by defense or strategy. For her, the aftermath was disorienting. Closure arrived without the triumph she had imagined in darker moments. There was no sudden lightness, no rush of vindictive satisfaction. Instead, there was space, vast and unfamiliar, where fear had once dictated every movement. She realized then that the enemy she had been fighting for years was gone, and with it the structure that had shaped her identity. The future no longer required resistance. It required intention. That night, she stood alone for a long time, looking out over the estate that had become her home through circumstance and choice. Vindication had returned her freedom completely. No one could force her to stay. No one could compel her to leave. The marriage, stripped of necessity at last, stood exposed as what it truly was, a bond now sustained only by what they were willing to choose. And for the first time, she understood that the greatest challenge ahead was not defending her worth, but deciding what to do with it now that it no longer needed defense. Society attempted reconciliation with remarkable speed, as if distance could be erased simply by stepping back into familiar patterns. Invitations arrived bearing softened language, carefully phrased to suggest continuity rather than reversal, as though the past years had been an unfortunate misunderstanding now conveniently resolved. Apologies followed, measured and impersonal, offered in tones that avoided responsibility while implying goodwill. She observed the efforts with composed detachment, recognizing the instinct beneath them. Acceptance was being extended now that it carried no cost. Vindication had made her safe to acknowledge again, and safety, she understood, was often mistaken for virtue. The Duke refused every overture without hesitation. His responses were polite, brief, and final. He did not argue, nor did he explain. He declined invitations that required forgetting, withdrew from circles eager to reclaim his presence without reckoning, and made no effort to smooth the discomfort his refusal created. The clarity of his rejection unsettled those who had expected relief. Society was accustomed to forgiveness offered upward, never demanded inward. His refusal forced memory where forgetting would have been easier. She witnessed his decisions with quiet astonishment. This was not defense on her behalf, nor protest born of anger. It was independence, enacted deliberately, a refusal to allow others to define restoration on their own terms. He was not punishing the world for its cruelty. He was simply no longer interested in belonging to it. The realization shifted something within her. His choice was not about loyalty alone. It was about the life he intended to live. Together, they stepped further outside the structure that had once governed them. The world continued its rituals without them, adjusting as it always did to absence that refused explanation. Within the estate, the effect was stabilizing rather than isolating. Without the pressure of social expectation, daily life grew quieter, more intentional. Decisions were made for function rather than appearance. Authority was exercised without performance. The space they inhabited became theirs, in a way it never had before. Emotionally, the refusal altered the balance between them. She no longer felt shielded by his position, nor burdened by his sacrifice. What he relinquished, he did so willingly, without resentment. What she gained, she did so without apology. The marriage, once framed by necessity, now stood firmly on shared values rather than shared defense. They were not united against society. They were simply no longer governed by it. That evening, she realized something with sudden clarity. Vindication had returned her name, but his refusal had given her something quieter and far more enduring. The assurance that she was not being tolerated, restored, or forgiven. She was being chosen, again and again, not because the world had changed its mind, but because he had already changed his. With the world no longer pressing so insistently against her boundaries, she began to occupy her place openly, without concealment or apology. She did not retreat behind the Duke's name, nor did she allow his authority to speak for her where her own voice now carried weight. When she attended gatherings necessary to the estate's governance, she did so composed and deliberate, neither inviting approval nor bracing for rejection. Her presence no longer felt provisional. It felt claimed. Those who encountered her were forced to adjust not because of title, but because of certainty. She did not explain herself. She did not correct the past. She simply stood within the present, refusing to perform gratitude for justice long delayed. The Duke watched this transformation with restrained admiration, careful not to eclipse it. Where once he had positioned himself protectively, he now stepped aside just enough to allow her authority to be visible as her own. Support became partnership rather than shelter. In council, he deferred to her judgment without announcement. In decision-making, her perspective shaped outcomes as often as his. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Equality settled not through declaration, but through practice. Those around them adjusted accordingly, learning that her influence did not require validation to be real. For her, the change carried profound emotional weight. Years of being defined by absence had taught her to minimize impact. Now, impact returned without resistance from within. She felt confidence re-emerge not as bravado, but as alignment, an internal coherence that no longer depended on external permission. The fear that she might overstep, that she might claim too much, gradually loosened its grip. She realized that dignity was not preserved by shrinking, but by standing fully within one's truth. The realization did not inflate her sense of self, it steadied it. The marriage, too, shifted under this clarity. She no longer viewed herself as occupying borrowed space or living under conditional protection. What bound them now was not rescue nor sacrifice, but mutual recognition. The Duke did not guard her from the world. He stood beside her within it. She did not temper her presence to ease his burden. She shared it. The balance between them felt deliberate and earned, shaped by choice rather than reaction. Externally, the world continued to recalibrate. Some responded with renewed respect, others with quiet discomfort. Neither response concerned her. Vindication had removed the need to persuade. Belonging, she understood now, was not something to be negotiated. It was something claimed. That evening, as they walked to the grounds together, she felt a stillness she had not known before. Not the stillness of endurance, but of arrival. She had not reclaimed a past she once imagined. She had claimed a present shaped by courage, clarity, and self-possession. And for the first time, she understood that the life unfolding before her was not a correction of injustice, but the beginning of something wholly her own, shared freely with a man who did not require her diminishment to stand beside her. The conversation that finally named what had long been shaping itself between them unfolded without ceremony, as if both understood that anything ornate would misrepresent the truth they were prepared to face. They spoke in the quiet of an evening that required no witness. The air settled into stillness that invited honesty rather than demanded it. There was no moment of revelation, no sudden rush toward declaration. Instead, they acknowledged the difference between the marriage they had entered and the bond that now existed, between duty fulfilled and love chosen. The distinction mattered. It marked the boundary between what had been necessary and what was now freely desired. He spoke first, not to persuade, but to clarify. What he felt, he said, was not obligation transformed into habit, nor gratitude mistaken for affection. It was devotion formed through witnessing, through watching her stand without shrinking, through sharing consequence without resentment, through choosing integrity when retreat would have been easier. He did not claim inevitability. He claimed intention. Loving her, he understood now, was not a culmination of circumstance, but a decision renewed daily. It required nothing from her except honesty in return. She listened without interruption, aware that the moment asked not for defense but courage. When she answered, it was with the same clarity that had guided her through disgrace and vindication alike. She told him that what frightened her most had never been loss, but imbalance, the fear that love would demand her diminishment as proof. What she felt for him had grown, not because he protected her, but because he refused to own her survival. He had allowed her to remain herself, even when it would have been easier to define her by what he had given. That, she said, was the ground on which she could choose him freely. What passed between them then was not a promise of ease, but of equality. They acknowledged that love would not erase consequence, nor guarantee permanence. It would require the same discipline and intention that had shaped every choice thus far. Yet unlike endurance, love invited presence rather than withdrawal. It asked not for silence, but for participation. The shift was quiet, but complete. Where once restraint had functioned as boundary, it now became foundation. They moved closer, not in urgency, but in assurance, allowing affection to exist without disguise. Touch, when it came, was unhurried and deliberate, carrying none of the desperation of those afraid to lose what they had just found. It felt earned. Later, as the evening deepened into night, they remained together without speaking, the world outside their window distant and irrelevant. What mattered was not what had been overcome, but what had been chosen. The marriage, once defined by necessity, had been transformed by consent into partnership. Love, once restrained by fear of imbalance, now stood grounded in trust. For both of them, the moment marked not an ending, but a beginning, one shaped not by the need to survive, but by the willingness to belong fully, without apology or reservation, to a life deliberately chosen together. The consequences of the Duke's final decision unfolded not as catastrophe, but as quiet contraction, the kind that reshaped a life through absence rather than confrontation. Privileges he had once assumed immutable dissolved with polite finality. Positions offered and then withdrawn, influence redirected elsewhere, invitations that simply ceased to arrive. All of it occurred without accusation, as though the world wished to pretend the narrowing had always been inevitable. He accepted the losses without spectacle or complaint, understanding that what he relinquished had never truly belonged to him if it required silence to be kept. The clarity that followed surprised him. Power, stripped of performance, felt lighter. What remained was choice, unadorned and sufficient. She watched the shift with unflinching awareness, determined not to meet sacrifice with guilt. For years, she had learned to measure her presence by the cost it imposed on others, believing restraint to be a form of virtue. Now she refused that calculus. If he chose loss, she would not dishonor that choice by diminishing herself. Instead, she met it with steadiness, standing beside him not as cause, but as companion. The distinction mattered. Their partnership did not require apology to justify itself. Together, they began to reshape the boundaries of his estate, redirecting resources once dedicated to influence toward purpose, more tangible and lasting. Tenant protections were formalized. Long, neglected lands restored. Obligations clarified so that power no longer functioned as abstraction. The Duke found unexpected satisfaction in work that produced visible impact rather than silent leverage. Legacy, he realized, did not need to be expansive to be meaningful. It needed to be deliberate. Emotionally, the shift deepened their bond in ways affection alone never could. Loss was acknowledged without being dramatized. Grief allowed space without consuming identity. She became his anchor not by offering consolation, but by sharing perspective, reminding him of what had been gained alongside what had been surrendered. He, in turn, allowed himself a vulnerability he had long denied, trusting that strength did not require solitude. Their roles no longer followed expectation. They moved fluidly, supporting and yielding as needed, unbound by prescribed balance. The world beyond their gates continued its quiet recalibration, adjusting to their absence with the same indifference it had once shown her disgrace. Neither sought to re-enter it on altered terms. What they were building did not require validation. The estate settled into a rhythm defined by intention rather than appearance, where authority was exercised transparently and belonging did not depend on approval. One evening, as they reviewed accounts together by lamplight, she realized that what had once been unimaginable now felt inevitable. The Duke she had first encountered, a man defined by restraint and expectation, had chosen transformation without resentment. And she, once defined by endurance, had learned to inhabit a life not organized around defense. The sacrifices they had made did not diminish them. They clarified them. In the quiet that followed, she understood that the unthinkable choice he had made long ago was not the marriage itself, but the refusal to live a life misaligned with his values. And in choosing that refusal, again and again, he had given them something no title or alliance ever could, a future shaped not by what was lost, but by what they were willing to claim together. The weight of what the Duke had relinquished did not descend all at once. It arrived gradually, settling into the spaces where certainty once lived, testing not his resolve but his resilience. There were moments when the absence surprised him, an invitation expected but never delivered, a correspondence unanswered, a decision made elsewhere that once would have required his voice. These omissions did not wound his pride so much as they reminded him how deeply his life had once been shaped by deference he no longer received. He did not regret the choice, but he felt its echo, a quiet grief for a version of himself that had been permitted power without scrutiny. Letting go, he discovered, required more than conviction. It required mourning. She recognized the shift before he named it. Years of reading rooms and silences had taught her how loss disguised itself as composure. Where others might have offered reassurance too quickly, she offered presence. She did not attempt to reframe what he had given up as necessary or noble. She allowed it to exist as loss, unsoftened and acknowledged. In that allowance, something within him steadied. Strength, he learned, did not require denial. It required honesty shared without judgment. Their roles continued to evolve, no longer defined by who protected whom, but by what each could offer in moments of uncertainty. Where he had once been the constant, she became it now, anchoring him with perspective shaped by endurance. She reminded him, gently and without insistence, that the life they were building did not need the approval of those who had benefited from his silence. What they had chosen had narrowed the world, but it had also deepened it. Meaning, she knew, was not found in breadth, but in alignment. As months passed, the estate reflected this shift. Work progressed steadily, guided by decisions rooted in care rather than reputation. The Duke found himself engaged in matters he had once delegated without thought, discovering satisfaction in outcomes that required attention rather than authority. She worked beside him not as assistant or overseer, but as equal, her judgment trusted without qualification. Together, they reshaped routines until collaboration felt instinctive. The household responded in kind, mirroring the stability that came from leadership exercised without pretense. Emotionally, their bond settled into something resilient and unadorned. Love no longer required articulation to be real. It existed in the way they anticipated each other's needs, in shared silence that carried comfort rather than distance, in laughter that surfaced unexpectedly, unburdened by fear of fragility. The reversals they had endured, his loss, her vindication, no longer felt like opposing forces. They had become shared history, binding rather than dividing. One evening, as they walked the grounds under a sky unmarked by ceremony, the Duke admitted quietly that he had once believed strength meant standing alone. She answered without hesitation that endurance had taught her the opposite, that survival without connection was merely persistence, not life. In that exchange, brief and unremarkable to anyone else, the last remnants of imbalance dissolved. They stood not as benefactor and beneficiary, nor as protector and protected, but as two people who had chosen to remain present through loss and transformation alike. The future ahead did not promise ease. It promised honesty, effort, and consequence. Yet as they turned back toward the house they now shared fully, both understood that what sustained them was not what had been preserved, but what had been willingly rebuilt together, piece by piece, choice by choice, without illusion and without regret. Their life together became visible not through declaration, but through accumulation, the quiet layering of days shaped by mutual regard rather than expectation. Love revealed itself in habit before it ever appeared in language, settling into the spaces where fear once governed movement. Mornings unfolded without ceremony, shared in companionable silence or easy conversation, neither of them feeling the need to mark what had already become natural. Decisions were made jointly, not because agreement was always effortless, but because disagreement no longer threatened balance. They trusted the process of choosing together, even when paths diverged briefly before converging again. The estate reflected this steadiness. Where uncertainty had once lingered, there was now rhythm. Servants moved with confidence born of clarity, no longer gauging authority by proximity to power, but by consistency of direction. Tenants spoke of the household with respect that did not depend on fear or obligation. The changes were not dramatic, but they endured. Leadership, she had learned, was not proven through command, but through reliability. The Duke saw this truth mirrored back to him daily, reinforcing the belief that what they had built was not fragile, but rooted. Affection expressed itself through action rather than assurance. He ensured her work was supported without claiming it. She anticipated his needs without diminishing her own. They shared responsibility without tallying sacrifice. In moments of disagreement, neither retreated into silence nor escalated toward dominance. They listened, they adjusted. The discipline that had once been necessary for survival now served partnership, lending structure to intimacy rather than distance. Love did not undo who they were. It refined them. Their pasts no longer pressed so heavily against the present. Her disgrace, once the defining frame of her identity, receded into context rather than consequence. His authority, once inseparable from expectation, softened into stewardship, shaped by intention. Together, they inhabited a life that neither had been prepared for, yet both recognized as right. The absence of constant vigilance felt like freedom earned rather than granted. Occasionally, reminders surfaced, letters from distant acquaintances attempting tentative reconnection, invitations that hinted at restored favor. These were acknowledged and declined without discussion. Neither felt the need to justify their choices. The world beyond their gates no longer dictated worth. What mattered was contained within the life they shared, shaped by principles that no longer required defense. In quieter moments, she found herself reflecting on how fear had once governed every decision, narrowing possibility until endurance became identity. Now, fear still existed, but it no longer ruled. She could imagine a future not organized around avoiding loss, but around cultivating meaning. The Duke, too, recognized a shift within himself. Where once he measured success by reach and recognition, he now measured it by coherence, by whether his actions aligned with the life he wished to live. One evening, as they sat together watching the last light fade from the fields, she realized that love had not arrived as rescue or reward. It had arrived as partnership sustained over time, built through patience, shared consequence, and trust renewed daily. The realization carried no urgency, only peace. They did not speak of it. There was no need. What they had created spoke clearly enough, a life not defined by what had been taken from them, but by what they continued to choose, quietly and deliberately, in each other's presence. The final test arrived wearing the familiar mask of opportunity, presented not as coercion but as restoration, as though what had been lost could be returned without cost if only the proper concession were made. The offer came through intermediaries, skilled in framing compromise as generosity. A position once withdrawn could be reinstated. Influence could be reclaimed. The narrowing of the Duke's world, so quietly enforced, could be reversed with equal discretion. There was only one condition, delivered gently, almost apologetically. His wife would need to step aside from visibility, not dismissed, not disgraced again, simply removed from prominence, rendered unobtrusive so equilibrium could be restored without embarrassment to anyone involved. The Duke read the terms without expression, recognizing the precision of the trap. The proposal was designed to appear reasonable, even merciful, relying on the assumption that comfort would eventually outweigh conviction. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he brought the matter to her without alteration or shielding, laying the truth between them as it had been offered to him. There was no hesitation in his voice, only transparency. Whatever decision followed would be shared. She listened carefully, surprised by how little turmoil the offer stirred within her. Once, such a proposal would have terrified her. The suggestion of stepping aside, of becoming less visible to preserve another's future, echoed arguments she had internalized for years. But endurance had taught her discernment, and love had taught her clarity. She saw the offer for what it was, not restoration, but erasure repackaged as compromise. The cost was not her presence alone, but the integrity they had built together. They considered it openly, not as adversaries weighing sacrifice, but as partners measuring alignment. What would be gained was familiar, ease, recognition, influence restored. What would be lost was quieter, but absolute. The life they had chosen deliberately, the equality they had forged through consequence rather than convenience. The decision required no prolonged debate. The answer settled between them with calm inevitability. Their refusal was unified and unembellished. The Duke declined the offer without explanation, without counterproposal, without apology. He did not frame the refusal as moral superiority or grievance. He simply withdrew consent from a future that required him to deny the present he had chosen. The response unsettled those who had extended the offer precisely because it carried no anger. It could not be negotiated with. In the days that followed, the final threads of influence loosened completely. What remained fell away without resistance, as if the world had been waiting for certainty before releasing its hold. The Duke felt no regret, only confirmation. The test had not challenged his resolve, it had affirmed it. What he valued most could not be recovered through compromise, because it was not something he had lost. For her, the moment carried quiet triumph, not because she had been defended, but because she had not been asked to disappear. She stood beside him without shrinking, without gratitude demanded or given. The choice they had made together sealed what had already been true. Their bond did not exist in opposition to the world, but independent of it. That evening, as they walked the grounds in unremarkable silence, she realized that the final test had not been imposed by society at all. It had been the question of whether they would trade meaning for ease when given the chance. They had not, and in that refusal, they secured something far more enduring than restored influence, a life that could not be bargained away, because it was no longer defined by anything outside their own choosing. The acknowledgement did not arrive as proclamation, nor did it seek the drama so many had once imagined would accompany her full return to standing. It unfolded instead during a gathering convened for practical purpose, not celebration, a meeting of regional stewards, magistrates, and estate holders whose presence reflected governance rather than spectacle. The setting itself mattered. There was no music, no ornamentation designed to impress, no audience hungry for reversal or scandal. This was a room accustomed to authority expressed quietly, where words carried consequence without needing flourish. It was here, in a space that valued function over display, that the Duke chose to speak her name. She had not expected it. Vindication had restored her legitimacy, partnership had reshaped her role, and love had found its place without public declaration. Recognition, she believed, no longer required announcement. She attended the gathering as she had attended so many others since, composed, observant, prepared to listen more than speak, unless asked. Her presence was no longer questioned, but neither was it highlighted. She had learned to value that balance. Yet as discussion turned toward matters she had helped shape, tenant protections, resource allocation, long-term stewardship, the Duke shifted the focus deliberately, redirecting attention without raising his voice. He spoke of the decisions that had guided the estate through years of uncertainty, naming them plainly, attributing outcomes without exaggeration. When he credited her judgment, it was not as adjunct or influence, but as authority exercised in her own right. He referred to her not as his wife in possession of his standing, but as his equal partner, whose insight had altered the direction of governance materially and for the better. Then, without pause or qualification, he spoke her name in full, unsoftened by title or explanation, anchoring it firmly within the context of leadership rather than rehabilitation. The effect was immediate and profound. Silence fell, not the charged silence of scandal remembered, but the attentive stillness that followed clarity. For those who had once dismissed her, the moment carried weight not because it contradicted their memory, but because it rendered that memory irrelevant. She was not being restored to favor. She was being acknowledged as fact. The distinction was unmistakable. She felt the recognition settle slowly, not as triumph, but as completion. Years of endurance had taught her to expect vindication, if it came at all, to arrive late and compromised. This was neither. It did not apologize for the past, nor did it attempt to repair it through performance. It simply affirmed the present. She did not bow her head. She did not smile. She met the room's attention with the same steady composure that had sustained her through disgrace, now stripped of necessity but not relinquished. Dignity, she understood, did not change shape with circumstance. It merely revealed itself more clearly. What moved her most was not the acknowledgement itself, but the manner of it. The Duke did not frame her strength as exceptional because of what she had endured, nor did he romanticize her resilience. He spoke of her discernment, her steadiness, her capacity to lead without spectacle. He did not contrast her with the past version of herself, as though she had been remade by suffering. He spoke as though she had always been this woman, and the world had merely taken too long to see her. In doing so, he closed a chapter that had lingered unfinished for years. Those responsible for her ruin were no longer present to witness the moment. Their absence was fitting. Justice, she realized, did not require their observation. It required acknowledgement from those who now held power, and from the man who had chosen to stand beside her when standing alone would have been easier. His words did not seek approval from the room. They established reality. Whatever discomfort followed belonged to others to resolve. Afterward, there were responses, measured affirmations, carefully chosen words of agreement, nods offered with varying degrees of ease. Some were sincere, others pragmatic. She did not weigh them. Their meaning had diminished. What mattered had already occurred. The room had adjusted, and with it, the future. Later, when the gathering dispersed and the estate settled back into quiet, she found herself alone for a moment in the corridor beyond the chamber. The stillness there carried a different quality than it once had. It was no longer the stillness of waiting, nor of bracing for judgment. It was the stillness of arrival. She rested her hand briefly against the stone wall, grounding herself not out of habit, but recognition. The life she now inhabited did not require vigilance to maintain. It required presence. The Duke joined her without comment, as he so often did now, his steps familiar, his proximity unremarkable and deeply known. He did not ask how the moment had felt, nor did he seek acknowledgement for what he had done. They had long since moved beyond the need to mark each gesture. Still, she turned to him, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that carried gratitude without obligation. "You didn't have to," she said quietly, not as protest, but acknowledgement. "I wanted to," he answered simply, the words unburdened by justification. It was true. The simplicity of the exchange undid something final within her. For so long, truth had been conditional, accepted only when it served convenience or protection. To hear it stated without agenda felt like release. She realized then that the ruin of her name had not been the deepest injury. The deeper wound had been the distortion of truth itself, how easily it had been bent, how long it had been withheld. What he had done today was not merely to acknowledge her publicly, but to refuse distortion entirely. They walked together toward the outer doors, the estate beyond them quiet and expansive. The future no longer pressed against them as uncertainty. It opened instead as space, space shaped by intention, partnership, and choice renewed daily. She understood now that the unthinkable choice he had made years earlier had not been marriage, nor defiance, nor sacrifice. It had been recognition of her worth, of his values, of a life that refused to be governed by fear or convenience. As they stepped into the evening air, she felt something settle finally into place. Not victory, not vindication alone, belonging. Not granted, not reclaimed, but lived, fully and without condition, alongside a man who had never asked her to be less in order to stand beside him. The future did not announce itself with certainty or promise. It unfolded instead in measured days that carried no audience, shaped by choices repeated quietly until they became habit. In the weeks that followed the Duke's public acknowledgement, nothing dramatic occurred, and that absence of upheaval marked the true end of conflict. No retaliatory scandal emerged. No final whisper regained momentum. Society, having tested and failed to reassert its authority, adjusted as it always did to realities it could not overturn. What could not be undone was absorbed, normalized, and eventually forgotten. What endured was what they continued to build beyond its reach. For her, the most profound change was internal. Vindication had restored her name, recognition had affirmed her place, but it was freedom, true freedom, that altered how she moved through the world. She no longer woke, braced for judgment, no longer rehearsed explanations she would never give. The habits of endurance loosened gradually, replaced by intention. She found herself planning not in reaction to threat, but in anticipation of possibility. It was disorienting at first, like stepping into open ground after years of narrow passage, but with each passing day the unease softened into confidence. She had survived long enough to trust her own resilience. Now she learned to trust her happiness without suspicion. The estate flourished under shared stewardship. Decisions once postponed for fear of controversy were enacted thoughtfully and firmly. Tenants benefited from clarity and continuity rather than performative generosity. Infrastructure long neglected was restored with care rather than urgency. What emerged was not transformation for spectacle, but stability that endured. The Duke found satisfaction in this work that no former alliance had offered. Influence once measured by reach was now measured by impact, and impact, he discovered, carried a quieter but deeper reward. Their partnership settled into a rhythm neither had imagined, but both recognized as right. Love did not demand constant affirmation. It revealed itself in attention given freely, in disagreements navigated without fear, in silence shared without distance. They spoke openly when needed, but did not fill space unnecessarily. Trust had replaced vigilance. They no longer watched each other for signs of imbalance. Equality had become instinct rather than effort. There were moments, of course, when the past surfaced, not as threat, but as memory. She would sometimes pause at the edge of a gathering, recalling the years when presence itself had felt like transgression. He would occasionally note the absence of a name once common in his correspondence. In these moments, neither offered consolation nor dismissal. They allowed memory to exist without authority. What had been endured did not need to be erased to be left behind. As seasons shifted, the estate became known less for its association with scandal resolved than for the steadiness of its governance. Visitors arrived with curiosity rather than caution, responding to what they encountered rather than what they had heard. She engaged them with calm assurance, no longer wary of being misread. He stood beside her without positioning, without claim. Together, they presented a life that required no defense. Over time, even curiosity faded, replaced by acceptance so complete it ceased to notice itself. One evening, as autumn settled across the fields, they walked the grounds without destination, the air cool and unremarkable in its quiet beauty. The light lingered low along the horizon, turning familiar paths momentarily unfamiliar. She found herself reflecting on the path that had led her here, not with bitterness, but with clarity. The ruin of her name had stripped away illusion. It had taught her the cost of silence and the value of truth. It had shown her how easily worth could be misassigned and how deeply it endured regardless. She realized now that while she would never be grateful for what she had suffered, she did not regret who it had shaped her to become. He sensed the turn of her thoughts without prompting, as he often did now. When she spoke, it was not to recount pain, but to acknowledge change. She told him that once she had believed survival was the greatest victory available to her. Now she understood that survival had only been preparation. Living, fully, deliberately, without apology, was the greater courage. He listened without interruption, aware that her words did not seek reassurance. They marked arrival. He responded not with grand affirmation, but with truth as he had always offered it. He told her that his unthinkable choice had never felt unthinkable once made. The greater impossibility, he admitted, would have been returning to a life defined by convenience after seeing so clearly what integrity demanded. Standing beside her had not diminished him. It had clarified him, He was no longer divided between duty and conscience. They had become one and the same. They paused near the edge of the grounds, where the land opened outward, unclaimed by walls or ornament. The view stretched wide and uninterrupted, the horizon unburdened by boundary. It struck her then how fitting the moment was. Once, her future had felt closed, reduced to endurance within constraint. Now it expanded without urgency, shaped not by necessity but by choice. There was no declaration of forever, no vow restated. They did not need to promise what they were already living. Love had ceased to be something proven through sacrifice. It had become something practiced through presence. Whatever challenges lay ahead would be met not with fear of loss, but with confidence in what they had built together. As darkness settled, they turned back toward the house, the windows lit warmly against the gathering night. It felt less like returning to shelter and more like entering a life fully claimed. She understood now that her dowry had never measured her worth, that her ruined name had never defined her truth. What endured was choice, his, hers, theirs, renewed not in moments of crisis, but in the quiet continuity of days lived honestly. The world beyond them would continue to change, as it always did, indifferent and relentless in its cycles, but within the life they had shaped, there was constancy grounded in intention. She was no longer a woman waiting to be judged. He was no longer a man constrained by expectation. Together, they were simply themselves, equal, deliberate, and free. And in that freedom, unmarked by spectacle or regret, their story found its ending, not as correction of injustice, but as fulfillment of possibility, where love did not rescue or redeem, but stood, unwavering and chosen, as the life they continued to build side by side.